Welcome to our webinar today on sales and operations planning, putting together the pieces. My name is Laura Ciceri. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and we're going to let people gather here because no one ever gets to, a webinar at the time it's supposed to start. So I'm just going to go over some housekeeping. This is part of our monthly webinar framework. We share this open content to help supply chain leaders to drive improvements in supply chain. And I prefer a dialogue over a presentation. So as we go along, please put your questions in the chat panel and I'll take them as I go through the slides. All of the slides that I'm going to present will be archived. The presentation will be put on SlideShare. I'll put the webinar on YouTube. I'll also share with my LinkedIn community, and I encourage you to share it as well. Our goal is open content sharing, and we're trying to help supply chain leaders everywhere to improve their supply chains. Supply Chain Insights is now 7 years old. We sit on 9,000 quantitative responses and 15 years of supply chain financial data. We are trying to understand the choices that people make and what drives the greatest satisfaction by employees and also the greatest improvement in business results. And our focus in business results has been a balanced scorecard of growth, operating margin, inventory turns, return on invested capital, and customer service. We believe that sales and operations planning is one of the most important processes to focus on to drive improvement. In fact, in our research, we have correlated about 200 different factors with these metrics, and we find that four factors actually correlate. One is effective sales and operations planning. 2 is employee satisfaction. 3 is supplier development and the focus on supplier reliability. And 4 is effective planning. Some of those have some overlap, but those are the factors we find. We do not find that there's correlation to a specific technology, a correlation to a specific consulting firm, a correlation to a specific adoption of a practice. Instead, we feel that sales and operations planning should follow business strategy, and our definition of supply chain is from the customer's customers to the supplier's supplier. Now, one of the reasons why I'm going through some old content on this webinar, because I've been sharing this content for 7 years, is I had some feedback that people are like, Laura, you're so far out there with the digital supply chain and focusing on the autonomous supply chain. Can you go back and make sure that we have the basics? So today what I want to do is to go through the basics of putting together the pieces for technology for sales and operations planning. In this presentation, I am not going to endorse technologies. I'm going to talk about technology types. In a subsequent report, I will actually evaluate technologies, and I'm currently doing quantitative research. You can see my links on LinkedIn where I'm asking people to fill out my surveys on sales and operations planning to do more triangulation. So with that, let's get started. I look forward to your questions and your sharing and having a good time in our discussion. So the first question people say to me is, Laura, how do I know if I've got a good S&OP process? And I say, are you balanced between the S and the OP? And sales is not the S. Instead, it's the go-to-market strategies, clarity on go-to-market strategies. And the OP is not operations. Instead, it's looking at the balance of opportunity and the balance of our go-to-market strategies. Are we balanced? And most organizations are not. Only 28% of companies are actually balanced between the focus on our go-to-market strategies and our focus on our operational alignment. The second thing is, does your S&OP plan align to deliver the business strategy? Because clarity on the business strategy is important to be able to select a technology. I often find that companies will look at technologies on PowerPoint and they're not clear at the end of months of research around what is S&OP and how does it tie to business strategy. And I'm going to clarify some of those points with you today. The third thing is clear governance. Who makes the decisions in sales and operations planning? And the most balanced and the most mature companies, it's the profit center manager. And the divisions or the regions will often have the power focused on the profit center manager. However, I found some organizations where there's only one profit center manager and it's the CEO, and often those organizations have the toughest time with governance. I also find that many times companies will allow divisionals decisions that don't allow to corporate outcomes. So I work with one company that selected technologies for 27 divisions that were very different. That could be okay, except that the time horizons and the granularity of data was different at every division, so you couldn't roll up the data for corporate outcomes. And they actually had some cross-functional shipments in between plants, and that made it really difficult. So if you're allowing regions to make regional technology decisions, always be sure that they're working on a corporate calendar with clear governance around what does good look like. The other thing is sales and operations planning is a horizontal process that crosses functions. And if we're rewarding functional behavior, we will never be able to make technologies really work for us, and we will not be able to really drive the improvement that we want. So for example, inventory is the most important buffer for us to design and manage in sales and operations planning. If one part of the organization thinks that inventory is a bad thing, and another part of the organization is focused only on manufacturing excellence and running up inventory, you will always have issues with the balanced scorecard. So one of the elements is to agree, what does good look like? What are we going to measure across the company, not just functional metrics? So a functional metric might be something like lowest cost of procurement, or it could be the lowest transportation cost. And while those are okay metrics, they're functional. And when we're aligned in S&OP, we have a balanced scorecard with the functions focused on reliability to that balanced scorecard. The next thing is, can the technologies that you choose tie to sales and operations planning execution with clear what-if analysis? Only a third of companies have what-if capabilities. And what-if optimization says that you're able to answer the question of what happens if the business changes. If what-if capability is important, you need to be sure that that's in the RFP. Many times that will greatly differentiate which solutions work for you and which don't. The other is, does it deliver a feasible plan? If your return on invested capital is greater than 10% and you have manufacturing bottlenecks, you have to be careful in the modeling a tactical supply to be sure that you're able to model planned orders to have a feasible plan. And that includes being very clear on what those bottlenecks are. And there are two types of solutions. They're material-centric and they're manufacturing-centric solutions. And when we get to tactical supply, we'll get into those details. So what does S&OP look like? Well, we're clear on the business strategy. We're balanced between the S and the OP. We have clear governance in terms of who does what, what's the role of the region, what's the role of corporate. Every company looks different there. We align the functions to a balanced scorecard. We measure it. We tie the technology to not only plan, but also execute. And we want to be sure that we have a feasible plan. Now, the selection of S&OP often becomes very political. And it becomes very political because we got a lot of stuff. And most companies have multiple ERP systems and multiple advanced planning systems. And there is a goal in many companies for IT standardization. I believe, based upon my research, that IT standardization is the least important element of technology selection. I allege, based upon the research, that the most important piece is modeling followed by usability. And when we're clear on modeling and usability and what's required, we have a much higher success rate in S&OP. When we focus on technology standardization and really following a pretty PowerPoint, we are not as effective on S&OP. The other issue is that many times companies are like, well, I can just model it in Excel. Well, guess what? 68% of planning happens in Excel, and most people cannot be effective in modeling sales and operations planning in Excel. The supply chain is a complex nonlinear system that requires the balancing of many, many factors. And so one of the things you want to do is select an S&OP tool that people like enough that they give away their Excel spreadsheets. One of my measurements of sales and operations planning effectiveness when I go in and work with companies is, are they using Excel? And I'm not talking about perhaps technology that is a modeling tool on top of Excel or a technology that has an Excel-like front end. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about disparate Excel spreadsheets that are spread around the company and people use them. And we also see this with some of the evolution of tools like Anaplan, where Anaplan does not really have deep modeling capabilities, and while they attest that they're delivering the connected organization, often the building of those models will result in a disconnected world where everyone's working on a slightly different model without the ability to share. So let's start. S&OP should follow the business strategy. What are the right things to do to increase corporate value? And what are the right ways for me to make trade-offs to support the business strategy? If growth is important, I need to be outside in measuring what's happening in the market. If I'm going to be lowest cost, then I need to really focus on lowest cost. And I've got to be able to think about demand to maximize channel demand or consumption demand, build demand networks, and deliver demand as a stream of data to translate demand, not integrate, to supply. Now, the difference between translation versus integration is when I'm translating, I'm looking at the harmonization and synchronization of data so that perhaps I model the ship to and more advanced S&OP, but I can synchronize to a ship from. Secondly, how do I rationalize product portfolios and bring in higher level sales and operations planning thinking with the integration of new product launch? Often people will do S&OP work in the middle stage gates of product development to be able to look at design of products and to be able to look at new product launch and sales and operations planning. And sales and operations planning follows very closely with the design of the network to be able to drive the right answers and building supply networks. It fits into a matrix of horizontal processes that stretch from demand to supply that include revenue management, what am I doing in price and promotion, sales and operations planning, which is looking at demand and supply and inventory management, to new product launch, to corporate social responsibility, to supplier development. In this management of horizontal processes, then I'm looking at the world of a horizontal process that allows me to stretch across the organization. Now, many times people will have a supply chain center of excellence, and it's one thing to say excellence, and then it's the other thing to deliver it. So we've got to get clear on what is supply chain excellence. And often people are very confused about who makes decisions. In some organizations, 16% of the regions all have power. This is a company like Unilever or J&J. In other organizations, divisions have the power. This is more common in chemical companies where you have large divisions. In other companies, we have corporate as the power. S&OP leadership should come based upon the governance, and it should be very clear who makes the decisions in both the selection of the technology and the use of the technology. The other trap that people have is they typically don't have one supply chain. They typically have 4 to 5 based upon the rhythms and the cycles of the supply chain. And the rhythms are things like demand predictability and supply volatility and production reliability and seasonal demand and customer sentiment and bottlenecks. And the cycles are things like lead times, capacity scheduling, delivery lead times, product life cycles, cure times, order cycle times. The cycles can be easily modeled in the technology. The rhythms are more difficult, and the rhythms drive how many supply chains you have, and the technology should be based upon all of the supply chain types you have. And in each supply chain type, you want to be able to reach the balance of growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity to be able to drive the models to be able to do this. So I say, before you start sales and operations planning, plot your long tail, understand how many supply chains you have, where you've got items that are very high volume, very easy to predict. Those are the efficient supply chain where you can focus on cost and you can focus on traditional supply chain processes. Where you have a need for a responsive supply chain with very short cycles, you've got to focus on your cycle time and your rhythms and be able to apply the right tactics and to be able to do that modeling. Where you've got an agile supply chain, where you've got a demand that is not very predictable and a supply that is much more volatile, you need more advanced technologies. You need things like attribute-based planning, attach rate planning. You've got to really be careful about push-pull decoupling points for inventory and be careful around planning modeling. So if you're in the blue area, about any technology will work. If you're in the red area, most companies have a lot more red, then you've got to be sure that you model and you basically choose the technology based upon the outputs given the balanced scorecard. And every company has 4 to 5 supply chains, and you want to plot monthly where are items in the supply chain and to be able to assign the right items to the right technologies for modeling. And then be able to look at how do you align those tactics of postponement and types of planning and rationalization with the different elements. Now, most companies go through maturity. So when you buy technologies, don't accept that you're going to buy, the end all when you get started. Get started. But, many times people just want to have a feasible plan. They want to be able to model demand, understand forecastability, and have a feasible plan. Start there. You don't have to have the most advanced modeling. And then they want to match demand with supply, which requires us to make trade-offs on planned orders and tactical supply, and to do modeling and demand, and to do some very basic modeling and inventory. And then we want to go to business-driven modeling, which allows us to take in financial factors. Sometimes people call this IBP. I, quite frankly, have a great distaste for the acronyms. I think we have far too many acronyms, and sales and operations planning is plagued with it. But if you're going into business-driven planning, then you need to add capabilities to translate volume to value, and you need capabilities to look at things like cost to serve. Now, when you go to demand driven and you start to embrace channel demand, translate channel demand, deal with push-pull decoupling points, deal with inventory flows, then we need to be talking about more advanced inventory techniques for form and function of inventory. And when we get to the orchestration of demand and supply, which allows us to orchestrate demand options to supply options, then we're talking about tools like the digital twin and more advanced simulation to be able to look at things like alternate bills of material, alternate suppliers. How can we improve the supply chain outcomes for perhaps mergers and acquisitions or new product launch? And so we've got to start with the goal in mind and evolve over time. Our first focus should be on a feasible plan. Can I model in manufacturing tactical planning a feasible plan? Is the plan that comes out with planned orders feasible and represent the tactical plan? The second part is, when I model demand, am I improving demand off the naive forecast, called forecast value add? And am I able to model demand, and how do I align the models for my multiple supply chain types? And then how can I bring in inventory analysis and profitability to improve that even more? So inventory analysis is looking at the design of buffers and the trade-offs against profitability. And then I start to go outside in. I start to get channel data and synchronize channel data more holistically. And then I become more of an orchestrator on the technology platform. And the market-driven orchestration gets us into more of the prescriptive cognitive analytics, digital twin, autonomous supply chain. But don't pressure yourself that you got to get there overnight. Start with a feasible plan. Start with getting really good at demand planning and translation. Now, not all companies are the same, right? So people call me up and they say, what's the best S&OP tool? And I'm like, it depends. It's sort of like buying a car, right? You know, there's a reason why there are so many cars. You know, the first factor is, how big is your organization? If you've got more than 25 planners, think about adding additional collaboration software. These could be simple tools like Tableau or ThoughtSpot, which is a search engine, or it could be Anaplan if you're a large company. But if you're a small company, take advantage of cloud-based, easy-to-use solutions, solutions like John Galt and Demand Solutions and Optimity, solutions that are easy to use and are easy to deploy. If you've got return on invested capital more than 10%, you must be able to model bottlenecks and deliver a feasible plan. Test the models to be sure that they're representative of manufacturing. If your error is greater than 40%, there needs to be inclusion of optimization, not just for safety stock, but for form and function of inventory to be able to utilize inventory as a buffer. I was teaching at a university the other day, and someone raised their hand and said, I thought with lean processes and supply chain excellence that we don't want inventory. And I'm like, well, we want the right inventory, and it's hard for us to get to the right inventory. But inventory is our most important buffer today because most companies have used up their manufacturing buffer because of very high return on invested capital. And of course, you've got to have clear governance. Who makes the decision? On what basis do we make the decision? What is your organization's willingness to take risk? What is your organization's capability to adhere to a plan? And then what's your skill level? And some companies have very advanced planners. You know, they've got 11 to 15 years of planning experience. They really know how to plan. And other organizations, you know, have somebody that's just come out of school, or perhaps they have somebody that's turning over the job every 2 years. And so usability is a really key factor. What should you take away from this slide? There's no one solution. Really think hard about your organization and where the system's going to be used. And if you have multiple technologies, that's okay, as long as they work on the same cadence, of the calendar and the discipline of planning in terms of what good looks like. So when we think about planning, we have strategic planning, which is plan by design. That is not what we're talking about here. Designing the network improves sales and operations planning. But here we're talking about tactical planning. This is the period from the slush period as defined in the APICS model to the tactical trade-off period to be able to look at how can I build a feasible plan. How can I make trade-offs in that feasible plan of when I'm buying materials, making choices of where to source? And it should not be confused with the executional time horizon where I'm in that slush period when I'm actually receiving orders. Now, the other day I was given a speech and somebody raised their hand and said, Laura, do we really need to do all this planning stuff with the Internet of Things? Don't we just do away with planning? And I laughed. I'm like, absolutely not. If we are just focused on replenishment and reactive replenishment, we lose a lot of ability for us to buy the right products, to set up the right design, and we become very reactive. We become very nervous, and we lose a lot of opportunities. So here we're going to focus on tactical planning. Let's start with demand. I want you to think about demand as a river. Demand is the river that flows through the value network, and where we choose to take the time phase snapshot and what is conventionally called demand planning is our choice. It could be upstream in the demand, it could be downstream, and material-centric companies, they'll often take the snapshot of demand closer to material buying. And customer-centric supply chains for consumer products, they'll take the time phase snapshot focused on the channel. However, we're hardwired for supply. When I teach, one of the things I do is I ask people to draw a supply chain. 99% of people that pick up a pen draw a supplier first. Very few companies understand demand. Things like, how do you measure error? What is forecast stability? What is forecast value add? How do I define hierarchies? Before you get started with S&OP, education is really important about demand. And I recommend that companies map the river. This is an example of a design thinking session that I did with a company where we mapped the river for the tributaries. We looked at what were our issues in the river of demand. In this particular issue, they are very heavily asset constrained. They had 22 million unforecasted cases, all those Excel spreadsheets of trade promotions and special packs that never were translated in the S&OP process. And then they had a lot of phase in and phase out inventory, which really needed to be an attribute-based planning model, and they had a lot of intermittent demand. So I recommend that you map the river of demand to understand what it looks like for you and what it looks like on the long tail. Now, most people don't do this. Most people jump right into buying technology off of a PowerPoint. And as a result, most people are not satisfied with their demand tools. They don't test the demand models. They ask questions that really show that they don't understand that we've got to align engines. Demand planning is all about the math. It's all about the engines. We want to have clean data, and we've got machine learning that's happening to clean up the data. Tools Group's doing a lot of work here. You see some evolution of JDA. Kinaxis is doing some work here. John Galt's doing some work here. That's all good stuff to clean up the data. But the engine and the ability of the engine to drive the output should be what drives your buying decision. And we mustn't forget about planning master data. So planning master data are things like, what are your locations? What are your cycle times? And managing planning master data is really critical because the engines work off of data and patterns in the data, master data, to be able to give a plan. And in your process, don't make the mistake of trying to get precise on imprecise numbers. Sometimes people will say, wow, I've got 50% error. Let's just go back and work the plan until I get it better. And I'm like, it might be 50% error. And if you've got higher error than 40%, we need to be talking about buffers and inventory and management the demand flows. So how do you make the selection? The first thing I want you to do is thinking about backcasting and testing the engines. Get 3 years of history to forecast a known value. So perhaps you're going to forecast 2018. Get the history for 2014 through 2017 or 2015 through 2017, whatever data you can get. Try to forecast the flows of the demand plan, your very efficient products, your responsive products, your agile products, and try to tweak the engines. Look at the definition of the hierarchies. Look at the definitions of the attributes to be able to predict known values like 2018. And then test different model options, whether they're attribute-based or attach rate or econometric modeling, which is looking at market-based modeling, things like housing starts and pricing and perhaps weather. Try all different models. Do this to test the models and work with a couple of vendors that you trust to be able to say, which of these technologies gives me the best outcome? And then align the engines with the type of demand. If you're a regional deployment like J&J, it may be that you're going to want to have a different tool in medical device and pharmaceutical because those engines are different. Just be sure that the discipline is there for the roll-up on a schedule and the roll-up based upon the corporate definitions, governance. Now let's think about supply. You must ensure that you can model a feasible plan based upon the bottlenecks. A tool like Kinaxis is very material-centric. A tool like JDA is very distribution-centric. A tool like OM Partners is very manufacturing-centric. Not all companies have the need for all three of these. And modeling is extremely important that you're clear on what you're modeling. The goal is to be able to produce planned orders to be able to be consumed by the material groups for aggregate buying and for finite capacity scheduling when we are able to fine-tune our plan. We want to be able to make the trade-offs in the tactical supply horizon to be able to do the right trade-offs to place the manufacturing load or the supply load on the right manufacturing facilities. And we must be able to be feasible. Now, if you only do it based upon volume and you don't have a tool that allows you to see cycles and allows you to see the impact of demand volatility, you'll make the wrong decisions. And you've got nuances, things like reverse bill of materials, floating decks, network modeling. Be sure you think hard about what defines modeling for you. And in the selection criteria for supply planning and for demand planning, you've got a lot of options. When you engage a technology company, be sure that the buying team understands how you're going to buy. You've got your engines, the modeling and the math, the scalability. A solution for Procter & Gamble is very different than a solution for my local food manufacturer down the street, which is Utz. They're big. Procter & Gamble's big. Utz is small. Modeling is important, scalability. User interface. How mature are your users in the use of the tool? Have them judge the interface, the collaboration, the what-if analysis, your partner requirements. Perhaps you have a partner that's dictating a certain tool. Understand that. The culture. How are you at early adoption of tools? A tool like LOCAD, which is Schema on Read, is only for the early adopter right now. Make sure the planning system is a system of record and focus on integration last. The first thing to focus on is the engine, the modeling and the math. The last thing is integration. In fact, I laugh because we have this kind of belief that integration, if I buy from the same vendor, like, 3-letter vendor, and I use their contract, that I'm going to have integration and things are going to be better. The only thing that will be better is that the IT team will be more familiar with the technology. But if you focus only on integration, most of the time you will not get the modeling and the math. And so make sure that you have something that will help you with modeling and math. Now let's take inventory. Most of the time, people are focused on transactional efficiency. They're not focused on policy of where should I hold inventory, or how do I effectively share data, or the role of commodities and commodity volatility in inventory, because we're in unprecedented volatility. And should that inventory be held at a supplier, or should it be held inside? And should I hold inventory as a raw material? And how do I translate demand volatility into aggregate buying strategies? And it's because we're not thinking holistically about inventory that our inventory levels are higher today than they were pre-recession. So when you're doing inventory modeling, you want to look at form and function of inventory, not just safety stock. We want to look at where do we place inventory, and in the tactical modeling, can we model that inventory? And then we want to be able to look at where should we hold inventory and in what form? What should be the cycle stock? What should be the safety stock? When should we build seasonal builds? So after we build demand, we build supply capabilities, we fine-tune inventory, we can add collaboration. And collaboration says, let me take all of my planning tools, including strategic planning, and let me overlay the ability for people in the back office to be able to get to core planning data. The people in the back office are often hundreds of thousands. So I work with a company that has 270 planners, and they've got 18,000 people in the company that need planning data. That requires a different tool set. That requires something like Anaplan, or perhaps ThoughtSpot, or a more advanced work with Tableau, a different form of analytics. But I often have companies that have 1 to 2 planners and 10 people in the back office. And, then I'm dealing with very different needs for collaboration. Perhaps it's Dropbox or Box, or, the sharing of spreadsheets. So be clear what you need in terms of collaboration capability. Don't just fall into the trap of, you need a big system. And one of the things I find really exciting in collaboration, particularly for large corporations, is the concept of the digital twin. The digital twin allows me to do discrete event simulation off of disparate systems to be able to look at trade-offs and to be able to model the trade-offs so that the executive teams can better understand them. And the evolution of the digital twin capabilities, whether you're dealing with lights out planning for Blue Cruise, or you're looking at the evolution of what Lamasoft is doing, the digital twin allows me to have more advanced modeling to be able to orchestrate to executives what is the feasible plan and why it matters. So in the thinking of inventory and simulation, you want to focus on tactical plan feasibility, forecastability, forecast value add, and the impact on customer service. Now let's face it, 60% of companies are looking at S&OP just to manage cost. And one of the biggest issues that companies have in S&OP is functions don't get along very well. In fact, manufacturing and operations are not aligned. If you want to have the highest bias and error, ask sales what they're going to sell and take that as a demand plan. We went backwards in the 2001 to 2004 period when we focused on collaborative sales forecasting because we didn't hold the sales team accountable for bias and error. Likewise, manufacturing will often be very focused on cost. So the organization is not naturally aligned. And when we manage cost, we must manage costs like we're a decathlete. We've got to focus on total cost, and you've got to build the analytic systems that allow you to get to total cost and make trade-offs. In my benchmarking, I've never found a company with the lowest transportation cost, the lowest manufacturing cost, the lowest procurement cost having the lowest total cost, because it's like a decathlete. In a decathlon, the competitor wants to be second or third in the event to be best, and so the only way to do this is to be able to measure total cost. And it's a mistake to think that just because you have ERP, you can see total cost. You may need a system that allows you to see total cost. Well, let me take some questions now. And, if you want my opinion on, current technologies, just fill them in, Laura's a direct shooter. Okay, forecast is a critical step in S&OP. How data science could be used to support this step. What are the companies effectively using data science? All right, data science, what does that mean? Often it'll mean open source analytics. And I find a number of companies using data lakes, using more advanced machine learning, but they're not ready for it. And the data science efforts are a lot like a dog chasing its tail. It's not tied to the mainstream processes. Most companies are not ready to adopt open source analytics and schema on read. Companies that are about 7%, and they're testing and learning about how do I use a data lake, use schema on read to be able to suck up the hierarchies and to be able to forecast using more advanced techniques like cognitive computing. Schema on read versus schema on write allows me more flexibility. Schema on write, which is the way normal or traditional planning processes always work, puts all the data in rows and columns in relational databases. Underneath almost every planning database is Oracle or Microsoft SQL or IBM or HANA. Those are relational databases. And data science, most of the time, they're open source and they're able to be schema on read. The more advanced companies are working on demand planning schema on read. It is really new, really evolving, and most people don't have the stomach for it. So what should a company look at and how to be able to look at value? Well, one of the things you've got to do is you've got to define what is value. It's really easy to define what is cost, but it's not as easy to define what is value. And that's why I advocate the balanced scorecard, to be able to let people see the trade-offs of the metrics to be able to determine value. And in the selection of technologies and in the implementation of your plan, you must start with the question of what is value? Question is, when I talk about demand-driven views starting from the customer's customer, how do I see the evolution of data that represents the truth as we know it versus political bias forecasts intended to be manipulated by buyer-seller dynamics? Are there industries that are doing this well? Well, Mike, the goal here is to look at the end consumption and to look at unbiased data in end consumption. So if you're selling beer and you sell to a distributor, you're always going to have some political bias going back and forth in that relationship. But if you look at the consumption of your beer versus the consumption of the market, you can see your market share and you can track your trends and you can see point of sale data. Focus on consumption don't focus necessarily on your downstream partners. And in fact, often people will assume that their downstream partners have good forecasts and they can just use them. I worked with a company the other day that had 33 retail forecasts, and only one of the forecasts was suitable to be used. So you want to test and learn with that and look at the forecast value add of the forecast of your partners. And really hold yourself accountable to forecast value add. What improves the forecast, and how do I move in that direction? How do we balance demand and supply in volatile times? This, Carlos is using the term bucka, which I hate the term bucka because, it sounds like something that happened after a bad party. But, in volatile times where I have very high demand error, I've got to be able to model, and I've got to be able to simulate, and I've got to be able to buffer. And so in the modeling, I've got to have clear expectations for what-if analysis. I've got to be able to buffer inventory based upon demand error. And I've got to be able to design the supply chain to absorb demand and supply error. Demand error has increased over the last decade, as has supply volatility. And so the ability for the engines to be able to model is really, really essential. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. We will be covering more of advanced techniques in planning at our Imagine conference, September 3rd through 6th. I handpicked all of the speakers for this conference. And we will be publishing an overview of specific technologies next month that actually goes through some of the research that we've been doing based upon reference calls, based upon interviewing the vendors. This is to give you a preview of the methodology and our mindset as you look at that report. And we've got a quantitative survey in the field. So thank you very much. Until next time, thanks for joining us today.